The silence inside Brussels did not begin as a crisis. It began as a routine, almost forgettable sequence of meetings that were meant to finalise yet another technical layer of the European Union's long-term budget. The kind of bureaucratic process that rarely attracts public attention and almost never triggers political earthquakes. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed? Perfect. Now enjoy the video. Yet within a matter of hours, that silence transformed into something far more dangerous, something charged with suspicion and urgency, because a document surfaced that was never meant to be seen outside a very small circle of insiders. And then buried within that document was a figure so vast, so precise and so structurally hidden that it immediately raised a question no official in Brussels was prepared to answer. Where had 1.8 trillion euros gone? For years, the European Union had cultivated an image of disciplined governance, a system built on layers of oversight, committees and institutional safeguards designed to prevent exactly this kind of shock. And yet what made this moment so destabilising was not simply the size of the number, but the way it appeared, quietly embedded within technical annexes and coded language that most policymakers never read in full, suggesting not an accidental oversight, but a deliberate design. And a financial architecture constructed in such a way that it could operate in parallel to the official budget, while remaining effectively invisible to public scrutiny. And it was this realisation that transformed a technical discrepancy into a full-scale political crisis. The inciting moment, according to multiple sources now speaking off the record, took place during a closed-door coordination meeting in Brussels, where senior financial delegates were reviewing final allocation frameworks, and among them was a Spanish representative whose presence had not been formally scheduled, but who had requested access under the justification of comparative fiscal review. A phrase that at the time raised little suspicion, but now appears to have been the first signal that something was already unfolding behind the scenes. Because what happened next was described by one attendee as a moment that shifted the entire trajectory of the discussion. When the Spanish delegate placed a printed document on the table and calmly asked a question that cut through the technical language and exposed the underlying tension, "Can someone explain this line item?" What followed was not an immediate answer, but a pause, long enough to be noticed and remembered, because in high-level negotiations, silence is rarely neutral. It signals hesitation, calculation, or recognition. And in this case, it signalled all three. As officials reportedly began scanning the document, cross-referencing figures and quietly exchanging looks that confirmed what they were seeing was not part of the standard framework, not something that had been debated openly or circulated through the usual parliamentary channels, but rather something separate, something that existed alongside the official structure without ever being formally acknowledged. And within minutes, the meeting had shifted from routine coordination to urgent inquiry. The document itself, now partially verified by multiple European outlets, including the BBC and The Guardian, outlined what was described internally as a strategic resilience operations mechanism, a term so deliberately vague that it provided almost no clarity about its purpose, while simultaneously granting it extraordinary flexibility, and attached to that mechanism was the figure that would soon dominate headlines across the continent. 1.8 trillion euros allocated through channels that did not appear in the publicly disclosed budget summaries, raising immediate concerns among economists and legal analysts about whether such a structure could exist within the legal framework of the European Union without explicit parliamentary approval. As news of the document began to leak beyond the confines of that meeting, the reaction was not immediate chaos, but a slow, accelerating wave of attention that moved from private briefings to journalistic inquiries and finally to public discourse, where it collided with an already fragile political climate shaped by economic uncertainty, rising inflation, and growing scepticism towards centralised decision-making in Brussels. And it was in this environment that the narrative began to take shape. Not as a single accusation, but as a series of interconnected questions that pointed toward a deeper structural issue within the union's financial governance. Italy, which had already positioned itself as one of the most vocal critics of centralised budget control, responded with remarkable saran and clarity as Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni stepped forward to address the emerging situation in a press conference that would quickly become one of the most widely circulated political moments of the year. Not because of dramatic gestures or inflammatory rhetoric, but because of the precision with which she framed the issue, presenting the document as evidence of a system that had moved beyond transparency and into something far more opaque. Something that she described as a parallel financial reality operating without democratic consent, a phrase that resonated across political lines and forced other leaders to respond. The escalation that followed was rapid and multifaceted, as media outlets began publishing detailed analyses of the leaked structure. Experts from institutions such as Oxford University were brought in to assess the implications, and social media platforms amplified every new development with a threat that traditional communication channels could not match, creating a feedback loop in which public pressure intensified political scrutiny, which in turn generated more information, more leaks, and more questions, each one adding another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Within the European Parliament, the atmosphere shifted from cautious concern to open confrontation as lawmakers demanded access to full documentation and called for emergency sessions to address what some were now openly referring to as a shadow budget, a term that captured the essence of the controversy while also raising the stakes, because if such a budget existed, it implied not only a lack of transparency, but a potential breach of the very principles upon which the union was founded, principles that emphasise accountability, shared governance, and the rule of law. The fallout extended beyond political institutions and into the broader public sphere, where citizens already sensitive to issues of economic fairness and governmental accountability began to express their frustration through protests, online campaigns, than public statements that reflected a growing sense of distrust, not just towards specific policies, but toward the system as a whole. And it was this shift in public sentiment that made the crisis particularly dangerous, because once trust is eroded at that level, it becomes significantly more difficult to restore. At the same time, other member states found themselves in a difficult position, balancing the need to maintain institutional stability with the pressure to respond to their own domestic audiences. And this balancing act produced a range of reactions, from cautious calls for investigation in Germany to more assertive demands for reform in Eastern Europe, each reflecting the unique political dynamics within those countries while also contributing to a broader sense of fragmentation within the Union. As the situation continued to evolve, new details began to emerge that added further complexity to the narrative, including reports of internal communications suggesting that the existence of the fund had been known to a limited group of officials who had considered the risks of disclosure and concluded that they could be managed through careful timing and controlled information release, a revelation that, if confirmed, would significantly alter the interpretation of events by shifting the focus from structural oversight to intentional strategy. The global implications of the crisis also became increasingly apparent as international markets reacted to the uncertainty and external observers began to question the stability of one of the world's largest economic blocs. With analysts warning that prolonged instability could have ripple effects beyond Europe, affecting trade, investment, and geopolitical relationships in ways that were difficult to predict but impossible to ignore. Despite the intensity of the situation, a clear resolution has yet to emerge, and this uncertainty has only added to the sense of tension surrounding the issue, as stakeholders at every level attempt to navigate a rapidly changing landscape in which new information can alter the trajectory of the crisis within hours, if not minutes, creating an environment where strategic decisions must be made under conditions of incomplete knowledge and heightened pressure. What remains clear, however, is that this moment represents a critical nut to hole for the European Union. A test of its ability to respond to internal challenges while maintaining the principles that define its identity. And the outcome of this test will likely shape the future of the Union in ways that extend far beyond the immediate controversy, influencing not only policy decisions but also the broader perception of what the European project represents in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. As the story continues to unfold, the questions that have emerged remain unanswered, hanging over the political landscape like unresolved equations that demand resolution. Because at the centre of this crisis lies not just a financial discrepancy, but a deeper issue of governance, accountability and trust. And until those questions are addressed with clarity and conviction, the uncertainty that now defines this moment will persist, shaping the decisions of leaders, the reactions of citizens, and the trajectory of the European Union itself. So the real question is no longer whether a hidden structure exists, because that possibility has already entered the public consciousness, but rather what it means for the future of European governance if such a structure can be created, maintained, and only revealed through unintended exposure. And perhaps even more importantly, what happens next if the answers that eventually emerge fail to restore the confidence that has been shaken so profoundly in such a short span of time? Because in a system built on cooperation and shared belief, the loss of trust is not just a challenge, it is a threat. So, and the way it is addressed will determine whether this crisis becomes a moment of reform or the beginning of something far more consequential.